And this was from the prior history. I did not reset any of that. And it looks to me like this thing had a problem. See how it went all the way up to 122 on the high? My guess is we have a bad cylinder or bad piston on this saw. 13s and 17s fairly common. Well, I know what a 13 is. Let's go take a look. Yep, I think it's a done cylinder. 17 and 13 together, you know, lean conditions, and then it's trying to lean itself out. So I would suspect that this saw right here is done. I mean, that's what it feels like, but that's also what the error codes are telling us too. So we're going to abort that one because it doesn't have a throttle cable. That's part of its problem. Let's update the firmware either way. I've got one other saw to put on Common Service Tool, and I'm going to be done for a while, and possibly for a long while with Common Service Tool. Simply because I think it's time to sort of retro back into the 70s and 80s. I'm going to probably get away from doing the saw repairs. Yeah, but see, that's your clue. If you look at that max high and the average high, that's a very, very, very lean number. You got to remember with Common Service Tool, when you're looking at the engine fuel settings, a low number means rich, a high number means lean. With a combination of those error codes, it went very lean, trying to compensate and pick up RPMs for what was probably a internal problem. I think a review on how the Autotune works is in order at this point, because you basically have these three separate conditions that it's designed to deal with. One is start, one is idle, low throttle, and the other is over 80% throttle under load. And the idle and the start, you know, I'm not going to really discuss that, but basically the starting situation is as soon as you start rotating that saw, the first couple of revolutions from stop, it enters into what it considers the starting phase, and it tries to maximize the fuel setting in order to get the thing to start easily. Now you got to remember that's in conjunction with your choke, and that oftentimes has created problems with people who don't understand that the saw itself as well as the choke are both trying to accomplish the same thing. Autotune is trying to get the best fuel configuration that it can in order to get the saw to start easily, and sometimes that's in conflict with the choke. And it's very easy to overchoke those saws as you have both the richer mixture as defined by Autotune plus the choke. I've always said starting cold with these things, that choke can't be on for more than 3 pulls. And then of course idling. And that's where it comes off throttle, the throttle snaps shut, and then it tries to bring that saw down to a predefined number of RPMs for idle. A lot of times you hear these things, they kind of step down. They drop to a low RPM, then step down to idle. And that's the Autotune correcting the fuel mixture, kind of like you with a screwdriver, adding some fuel or taking it away if it dropped too low in order to get to that predefined RPM for idle. So that does take a little bit of time, which explains to those who are paying attention how come you kind of see the saw drop to an RPM and then work to another RPM on these Autotunes. But what's really of interest to most of us is the underload. But also it's the essence of what Autotune's about. And basically what happens is when you're under full throttle or close to full throttle, what's happening is every couple revolutions the system does what's effectively a lean out test. That's what they call it too. And basically you have this little shuttle valve. It opens and closes at a fairly rapid frequency based on the firmware in the system, and how long it stays open versus how long it stays closed determines how much fuel is available to the carburetor, so it effectively leans or richens the mixture for the saw. Under load, it'll do that lean out test where it'll hold that valve closed for a couple revolutions, and there's a pool of fuel in the carburetor, and it begins to lean out some. Now, if that saw picks up RPMs as that mixture is beginning to lean out, that means the mixture was too rich, right? If that saw slows down as that mixture begins to lean out, that means that saw was too lean. And the Autotune will make a slight adjustment to try to correct based on what it found during that lean out test. It is always shooting to get that saw to max RPMs, which is effectively max power. It's like if you're on that saw with a screwdriver while it's in a cut, trying to adjust the mixture to get maximum power every couple of seconds. That's what's going on with that saw. Actually, every split second. And here's that 268 piston, and I took 40 thousandths to 40 thousandths pop-up. So the goal of this piston is to be able to put it in a unmodified cylinder, right? And using the gasket and everything. I did a Harbor Freight run and got myself a cheap chop-off saw so I can start making the tools a little faster, make it easier to cut the bar stock. I started rummaging around my junk pile and realized I did not have a good 50mm top end for 372 to try my magic piston with, inspired by one of the guys on the channel. So I dug around quite a bit, realized I just have a lot of this stuff. You know, this kind of goes back to the roots, so this is going to sound like a repeat because it kind of is. I just got a lot of stuff that if I don't use it, I might as well just throw it away, you know? So I set about trying to come up with a plan to build a 372, mostly OEM, possibly some aftermarket plastic, with the 50mm top end, of which I don't have, to put that piston in so I could run it side by side with the highway build that I had done a little while back, you know? And I did run into this. It had been wiped, and then a piece of metal, probably from a bearing or something like that, took a chunk out of this section right there. And I kept looking at it and kind of beat up on the top. Certainly not the best, right? But you know something? For what I want to do, it actually is going to work just fine. And I like to cut those down just a little bit anyway, so I'll get rid of that damage just with a die grinder by lowering that section of the sleeve, you know. You know, actually, I think what this came from was way back in the beginning of the channel. Bob and I were exploring the different aftermarket cylinders and aftermarket pistons, and he had put an aftermarket piston in this cylinder on a 2171 John thread, and it lunched and did this. So it's what I got, you know. It's better than it was. Let me clean it up. I don't think I have to do a lot more than that. I'm not going to change any port timing on this thing. I'm just going to run it pretty much the way it is. Yeah, on this kind of operation, it's pretty easy to get way out of hand. You really don't want to take off much, because if it's got a gouge or something along those lines, it's ruined. I mean, you'll just open it up too much to be useful, you know, if it's been damaged to that level. So just a quick hole and a little bit of oil. Clean up some of the stuff that was in the combustion chamber too. You know, see if we can get some life out of it and get a couple of smiles. But, you know, one subject I did not get into much, and I need to. When people see pistons, for example, they just see pistons. Well, the actual materials used in those pistons are slightly different. And if you look at the Melees, they kind of have that darker gray. They've developed that material for a very, very long time. So here's what you got to think about. When you have a piston in a cylinder and you have a lot of heat in the combustion chamber, which is a fairly localized area, a lot of that heat is pushing on the top of that piston and gets into the piston where it swells. Well, how does that piston cool? Well, a lot of the way that piston cools is through contact between the piston ring, and the sidewall, right? Also just from the piston itself and the sidewall, but the ring plays a big part in that. That's one of the reasons why the 2 rings is interesting to the production people who worry about warranty. The 1 ring piston is more interesting to the performance guy because it doesn't have to last that long and there's less drag because there's only 1 ring and the piston's usually lighter. So there's a good thing if you're looking for throttle response, you know, and that's a priority. Sometimes even RPMs, that's a priority over longevity. But when you're looking about longevity and you're worried about the cost of warranty because of a potential failure, the 2 ring piston becomes more interesting to you because there's more paths of contact to get the heat from the crown of the piston to the cylinder. Obviously it's going up and down, so it's distributing it as it goes. And obviously there's also heat transfer from the side of the piston to the side of the cylinder. Now, why do I bring that up? Because there is different materials between, say, the Melee and the aftermarket, just standard aluminum, and they might have slightly different expansion rates, given a change in temperature, which one grows faster, one versus the other. So I'm just going to throw it out there. It's possible. It's a possible concept to say that the Melee cylinder piston arrangement stock can handle those flash heat scenarios like I was doing with that one saw that stuck, where I'm going on a cold day from idling where the whole cylinder now is chilled down relative to the piston, right into a hard cut where all that heat builds very locally, really quickly. So there's a bigger difference in temperature from that piston to the outside of that cylinder, and it grows fast. Does the cylinder grow fast enough? Is it possible that maybe these materials that the stock Melee piston uses grows in sync with its cylinder better than, say, the cheaper materials used by aftermarket companies? So by me putting this piston in here, right, with the pop-up, higher compression ratio, different material, single ring, not knowing what the expansion rate difference between this piston with the material and the heat transfer capabilities is relative to this. Is it possible I'm setting myself up for another cold seas? And I'm going to say yeah, possibly. You know, and one of the things that I get asked is, oh, those saws that you did with the bearings and versus the ones with the plastic, the nylon cage bearings that I replaced in all the X-torques I can find. Well, did they survive? Well, a couple of them did it. Things like that made them fail. But for the most part, all those saws, for that matter, every saw that I did on video where I replaced the bearings with Natchies have all survived, with the exception of the ones that got crushed. This is one of those saws, and you know, since it came back, I got a case half that I can rob parts from, you know. Nothing wrong with that bearing. Nothing at all. I'll just clean it right up and I'll put it in my new junk pile build here. That bearing to cool right down. I got myself a nice bearing. Let me see if I can find some more. More parts mining. By the way, this is right here. That is what I usually see with the nylon cage bearings, unfortunately often. Now, one of the problems I have with these is oftentimes when it's gotten that bad, it's also opened up the pocket to the point where you really can't use it anymore because the bearing is a slip fit, not an interference fit. Now I'm going to leave it in the mid 200s, and if there's some resistance to that bearing coming out, that's a good thing. You see there is. I'm not going to force the issue in that case. I'm going to actually heat it up more. And that should do it. So that case half is still good. It doesn't appear, I mean, it looks like it did turn, but there's still enough interference that the other bearing won't just slip right in. See, it's got a little bit of bite and interference to it. I have another one here. See how it just slips right in there? That's no longer useful. I got to pull these little bits and pieces off this. There's good stuff on here, so I'll strip it later. But this is what happens when the PTO side bearing goes too long. You know, as soon as that saw starts going lean, that's when you want to start looking for bearing problems. You know, if it's not the obvious stuff. It's also why vac test is so crucial. Make sure if your saw is having a lean problem and it's not something really simple, if it goes back for like a second time and oh, I can't figure it out, go right to vac test, because that's where you're going to find the bad seals. And if it has bad seals on a newer saw, that means the bearings are shot. You see how that just went right in there? Now I got that almost to 300 degrees. It's cooling down pretty fast now, but that's the way I like to do it. You know, get rid of these pieces of crap. Wow, they're flipping hot still. This is going to be junk pile build part 1. I've been sort of scavenging things around the shop to see what I can come up with that'll actually produce a working saw. Alright, good to go. It's a little bit bent up handle, it's got some problems. I would never put this on anything but a fun saw because it's bent. You can probably see it just a little bit. And also the bar, the screws that hold the bar on, they're all stripped out completely. So you can't put standard handle screws in there at all. And I hope it doesn't leak. Alright. Let me get the tray and the handle on it. And then from there we'll build the rest of the saw tomorrow and make that part 2. Bit. All right, seals are in. Let's go ahead and get the handle put on, and then we'll put a flywheel on it and see whether or not we got some decent compression. When you're doing the handle, you can't forget that little bushing right there, but also that right there. See the proximity of the switch to the spring? Sometimes it makes sense to pay attention to that because you want to put the ground wire at the bottom, the wire to the coil, which gets grounded on the top, and minimize the chances of that wearing through and shorten your saw out right there. And you also make sure when you're doing stuff like this that if you look at the trigger, you see how the sleeve from the throttle wire goes in there, the cable. Make sure it's in there. Let me get the tray on first. I'm going to use an aftermarket carburetor. Basically all this stuff is aftermarket. Let's just see if it works. If it doesn't work, we'll get rid of it and put a real OEM carb on there. Another thing I need to do is get a pulse line. See if I got one laying around somewhere. Yeah, look at that. Cylinder. Need to find there's a clamp. Probably ought to 1184 it. Then put the piston on, all this mess on, bolt it all together, and call it good for tonight. I went and dug a flywheel out of the pile. I've got a whole bunch of them too. So, figure before I get too far into this, I'll just get the flywheel stuck on there. So they have their own integral keyway, and basically that just kind of goes on to where it settles right in, right? But sometimes I get questions, what are those 3 holes for? Well, if you have the version that have heated handles, that's where they put that little coil to generate the electricity for those heated handles. The number I like to use for torque on these is 26 foot-pounds. Another one of these discussions is what I typically do is you look to the arrow to see which direction the piston's supposed to go. But guess what? Some fool machined the arrow right off that piston. There is no arrow. So how do you know? That pin goes to the intake side. See the locating pin? That goes to the intake side every time. Oh yeah, I can tell you right now. Yeah, that has got some serious compression. The measure of the success in this video is if I can pull that plug and measure squish and have it be somewhere close to what I was shooting for, which was around 20 thousandths, right? Still have the pop-up. And remember, we just sort of shot in the dark with this. But I guess before I do that, I better crank the cylinder down. $22 thousandths. Can't beat that. I was shooting for 20. We just sort of did the math. You can go back and look at the last video when I was talking about it before I headed down to Bob's, or actually after coming back from Bob's. And well, while I'm here and I'm going to close off this video, I want to just make a couple of comments. And again, why do I do what I do? Everybody has their own definition of win. My definition of win is a easy to start saw that has good punch, and that's hard to quantify. But I like having a snappy throttle response where you hit that trigger, boom, it goes. It snaps right to. It has good power in the wood. I don't want to have to rev it to get that power, so I'm not into bringing the RPMs up. You know, even the 562, you got to rev that more than I really like to get the power. And I understand, I get it. It's what it is. So I like the bigger displacement saws. It's just, again, personal preference. Now, just decking the cylinder, you get a quite a bit. Doing a pop-up, you can get even more. Okay? Because basically the pop-up of a piston is protruding into the combustion chamber, right? So you have a smaller volume of gas air possible in the combustion chamber, which means given the same amount up there, it gets squeezed into a tighter spot. You get more compression. The reason I like doing that with a pop-up is 3 reasons. 1, it's really easy to do, right? It's a lot easier to take material off the piston, and even if you're not perfect, it's still going to be okay. You've got to have some skills to deck a cylinder and not mess up the alignment between the bore and the case. You know, I've put a fair amount of time into it. The second thing is, the very second you start taking material off the flange, those tabs which the cylinder bolts go through, let me grab a cylinder, you're making these a lot thinner. And they do bend down. They bend down stock with a guy with a heavy hand. Now you take off, you know, a lot of material, they're even thinner. So I like that less. And that also matters with really high compression saws. Now there's another very, very, very subtle thing. And that is if you drop that cylinder, say 50 thousandths, you're dropping the lower edge of the transfers by that same amount, right? If theoretically, when that cylinder is stock, when the piston goes to bottom dead center to open up those transfers, if the top of the piston or the crown of the piston is flush with that bottom edge of the transfer, that's maximum cross-sectional area, right? So now you drop it 20 thousandths and there's a little bit of a 20 thousandths bump, and that's not enough to matter. You drop it 40, 50 thousandths. Now what happens is there's a step where the piston crown is now a little further up that transfer, and you have this square edge where now the gas air mix coming up through the transfers hit that piston, has to bounce up a little bit. You're almost creating a turbulence. Well, no, you are creating a turbulence which actually cuts cross-sectional area of that transfer. What the hot rod guys have done is, through empirical data, realize that, okay, they got to get their cross-sectional area back and to make it run good. So they start raising the top edge of that transfer. You start moving the top edge of the transfer further up the cylinder relative to your exhaust. And what you have is a reduced blowdown number, because that's the difference between opening the exhaust first, the transfer second, how many degrees of crank rotation. You raise that edge, basically you're getting smaller and smaller amounts of rotation, like 18 degrees, 15 degrees, and the really fast saws you'll see have blowdown numbers in the high teens. Actually, if you go by theory, you want, for higher RPMs, a higher blowdown number, not a lower. So when people start arguing about theory, go read the books. And when you start seeing these saws that run at high RPMs with a low blowdown number, the first thing that tells you is they have a deck cylinder and that piston head protruded into the cross-sectional area of the transfers, and they had to get those blowdown numbers that small in order to get the cross-section area back. If you leave the top edge of the exhaust alone, that means the piston is being driven for a longer period of time before the pressure is released out the exhaust. And that too helps the torque numbers. So again, the saws that I do, I don't like to change that at all. I leave it right stock. And doing a pop-up, I get the compression with my pop-up, but I don't have that problem of closing off the transfer ports. So you get a whole bunch of things with a pop-up. You know, you get the compression, you don't close off your transfers, and you don't take material off of here. And for the saws that I like to build, again, I'm shooting for torque. I'm not really shooting for RPMs. So the net is the pop-up works for me. And I get saws that run the way I like. And since I only make them for myself, I'm not making them for anyone else. I don't care what someone else says. You know what I'm saying? It's a result of empirical data. I've done it both ways. I've ground the cylinders, and it's a pain in the ass to do it, but I've done it. And I've decked them and ground them, and you know, I've changed the intake timing. I've done all kinds of crazy things over a period of time, some of which has shown up in the channel and some of which has not. And I've come away with the conclusion that the best thing for me to do in terms of effort in versus return is to build saws with a pop-up piston. And I did that first in earnest with the 562s, and it worked really, really well with those.